Hello, and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. As we face the second anniversary of the October 7th attacks, it feels like a time to step back and reflect on the bigger picture of what it meant and how it and its aftermath has changed Israelis, Israeli leaders, and Diaspora Jewry. And yet, with so much playing out now in Israel, especially here at Haaretz, we're so absorbed in the day-to-day news of the war, that can be really challenging to do. So joining me to try to think about this bigger picture is Joshua Leifer. Josh Leifer is Haaretz's newest columnist, but his is hardly an unfamiliar name. His essays and reporting have been published in the New York Review of Books, New York Times, The Guardian. His book, Tablet Shattered, The End of an American Jewish Century and Future of Jewish Life, was published last year and won a National Jewish Book Award in 2025. And Josh isn't just a journalist, he's a historian too, working towards his doctorate in history at Yale University. Josh and I will talk about how the past 2 years have changed the country, with a focus on how it has changed the country's leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course, how it has transformed the wider Jewish world and affected Josh personally himself. Our conversation is coming up.
Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Joshua Leifer, welcome to the podcast and welcome to Haaretz.
Thanks so much for having me.
Josh, we've just gone through the days of awe. It used to be that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were the heavy-duty holidays. And then after Yom Kippur, we got to dig into the fun of decorating the sukkah, dancing around with the Torah and Simchat Torah. But I don't feel like the Jewish calendar in Israel is ever going to feel the same for the foreseeable future, given that the October 7th massacre took place on Simchat Torah. So it's going to keep feeling like the days of awe. It feels like the time of reckoning with God and fate are kind of extended. So let's continue to reckon on the podcast. In one of your recent columns, you noted that while Gaza City is under siege, Gazans are being killed by the day, the war is on, soldiers are falling, and despite the protests and solidarity for hostage families in Israel, it feels normal here. It feels like we're living our normal lives. In your column, you recalled over the summer that just days after the war with Iran, ballistic missiles had just destroyed these huge complexes, and yet our beaches were full. There were volleyballs, you wrote, interrupted by the occasional helicopter slicing its way back from Gaza, carrying wounded or dying soldiers to the hospital. And you wrote, increasingly, this seems less like a form of societal resilience and more like collective madness. And then you talk about the difference between denial and disavowal and how that shows up in Israeli politics. You said that Netanyahu supporters appear to be in denial about what's happening, but the rest of us are in disavowal. So I'd love for you to explain and unpack that a little, because I too wrestle with the difference between resilience and compartmentalization and denial about what's happening here.
I didn't invent the distinction between denial and disavowal. I was taking that from a Slovenian philosopher and kind of psychoanalyst, Alenka Zupančič. What she basically argues is that denial is sort of the way that the populist right functions and says, no, this isn't happening. The example she actually uses is climate change in the book that I was quoting from, and that what she calls the business as usual mainstream does is say, yes, I know it's a problem, and yet we persist in going about our daily routine. And so as you noted, I think that there is a parallel to how Israeli society has sort of processed the war in Gaza since October 7th. And on the right, you kind of have at times a perverse and spectacular kind of denial, which is like, none of the bad things that the world is saying we're doing, even though we actually just 5 minutes ago proudly said we're doing all those things. Like, no, we're not starving Gazans. But then they'll also say, like, we need to starve. This is sort of the Ben Tali Gottlieb, those sorts of people. But I think that the maybe more complex psychological phenomena is what you see in sort of the wide Israeli mainstream, which says, I think more people experience than maybe they even are willing to acknowledge publicly. Yes, we know that what Israel's doing in Gaza is terrible. We know that there is a terrible toll experienced by the soldiers who are there and also the people, the Palestinians who are bearing the brunt of that violence. And yet we go to the beach, we go to family, we carry on. Human beings this is both maybe why we're all here, but also part of one of the darker sides of the human condition is that human beings can adjust themselves to a wide variety of terrible realities. And the fact that Gaza is so close, and the fact that on those clear days where there's a low pressure, you can actually hear the explosions from Gaza on the beach in Tel Aviv or even in apartments. I think we're only at the beginning of being able to understand what that does to a society and what that does to people over time as they acclimate to a reality that should be unbearable but isn't.
And at least in my circles, people try to alleviate that by at least occasionally, if not weekly, attending one of the demonstrations, solidarity with the hostage families, protesting against the government, because it's something that they can do, but it's a little bit like sinning, and then going to synagogue on Yom Kippur. I mean, does it mean anything?
I think it does mean something. I think it means something for people's souls, to use that word, and for the politics of the country. I think that even if I have some critiques of the rhetoric or the approach of some of the speakers at the various weekly protests and rallies, I think that it's remarkable that Israeli civil society has sustained a protest movement for this long. It's hard for me to think of international comparisons, certainly not in the United States. And I think that is something to be proud of, in the sense that there is a critical mass of people, even if it's not as big as I would like, even if they don't always say the things I would like, that do, as you mentioned, go out every week and say, this isn't normal. We won't accept this to continue. Something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think this is a bigger question for political theory maybe, is what do you do in a democratic state when the government takes measures that are morally unacceptable? What are the means of resistance to those measures that remain within the rules of the democratic game? I know this is something that people in the United States are.
I was about to say, it's sounding pretty relevant lately for other countries as well.
Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of the people in a lot of places have had to grapple with as the meaning of democracy has been hollowed out and the accountability of leadership to the people has been, let's say, attenuated. And so, protest is one thing, disruption is another thing. There's been a remarkable amount of protest and disruption in Israel. It began with the judicial overhaul, but it's continued with just even a little break in the immediate aftermath of the war. What would be enough? I think that's a question I don't think I have the answer to. And I don't know, necessarily what the answer is. I was thinking about this recently because I was working at a library at Tel Aviv University, and there was a protest against the war, and the students, and I thought they were very brave, stood there with big black flags to say, in Hebrew there's the expression of a black flag flying over this to say, like, it's something that you can't commit. It's immoral. It's an immoral command. And I thought to myself, well, what else could these students do that would be effective? One of the perils of social movements is there's a kind of centripetal force toward radicalization, but that often harms movements more than it helps them, because in a democratic society, when you break out of the democratic game, for instance, through violence, that backfires and that leads to repressions. Even though in that article, I put forward the kind of challenge of saying this isn't normal and we should stop behaving as if it's normal. What that means in practice, I think, is something that requires further working out in practice.
Josh, let's talk about Super Sparta. Netanyahu's muscle-flexing call for independence. It was like a pep talk for the country's growing isolation, even from the United States, where Israel has lost the support of Democrats, and now some Republicans are on the way too. You wrote, quote, long-term isolation is far more likely to threaten Israel than to secure it. Every leading Israeli statesman has understood this basic principle. That is, it seems, until now. But this isn't a totally new theme for Netanyahu, is it? Don't you think that he's kind of aligned right now with the right-wing America First MAGA Republicans who say, hey, why are we helping Israel? And do you think that Israelis were sufficiently freaked out by these Sparta remarks? Do you feel like the isolation of Israel, which is so obvious and clear to us who spend time abroad, who are in touch with people overseas, is truly being understood here?
I mean, I think we're just at the beginning of the measures that are being taken against Israel that will deepen its isolation. We'll see what happens with something like the Eurovision. We'll see what happens with the International Soccer Federation. I think those will be felt by Israelis who maybe aren't traveling to Greece or France over the summer and experiencing what I think a lot of people experience there. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the Super Sparta speech since Netanyahu gave it, in part because it seemed like such a stylistic break from how he talks in public when he gives his official addresses. And what I mean by that is that this wasn't Netanyahu, the demagogue, or it wasn't Netanyahu, the mendacious political operative. It was Netanyahu, the business consultant with the slideshow. It was very businesslike. He seemed plugged into reality, which is different from how often even some of his recent press conferences where he seemed kind of like detached and sputtering, like at the UN General Assembly, actually. And so I think it was all the more chilling that he said what he said because he was in kind of Netanyahu realist mode as opposed to deranged, a better word.
He used to pride himself on a startup nation, which depends on globalization to succeed. He was, that was one of his proudest achievements.
And he even says this in the speech. He made Israel's neoliberal revolution. He made it a capitalist country in a large part. And now he was saying that the economy needs to take on autarkic markers.
Let's go back to the self-sufficient kibbutz.
Right, without any of the social infrastructure that made that possible. I think that what that speech reflected is a certain contradiction in what we could call the Netanyahu doctrine, which is that Netanyahu has always wanted maximal independence from the United States because, and this is something, that we see in the 1996 clean break memo that his advisors prepared for him. Weaning Israel off of American aid means that America will have less leverage to force Israel to come to some kind of compromise with the Palestinians. On the flip side, everything Netanyahu did in the 30 years since that memo was to deepen Israel's economic dependence on the United States. And I think the Israeli right in some ways can't quite come to grips with this dynamic of, on the one hand, wanting the strategic independence from America, but on the other hand, basically proposing no alternative geostrategic model that would enable it. In my most recent article, I compare Israel to a chess player who's lost almost all of his pieces except for the queen. And the thing about a chess player with really only a queen is that you can postpone the inevitable for a long time, but it's really hard to win the match. And eventually you either have to propose a draw or you have to fold. And in some ways, America is sort of Israel's queen. It's powerful. It's the most powerful piece on the board, but it's not enough to win the game. And so we'll see where that leads Netanyahu or Netanyahu's successor in terms of finding a way out of the diplomatic hole that Netanyahu has dug for Israel.
Josh, turning to Diaspora Jewry and its current crisis over Israel, in your book, you chronicled the replacement of religion to an extent among American Jews with Zionism. I'd like you to talk about that. I've spoken with other guests on the podcast, most recently Professor Adam Ferziger, about how it used to be that religion divided American Jews and Zionism and Israel united them. And to me, it now feels like it's the other way around. Israel divides them and religion unites them. At the Emmy Awards, we had Hannah Einbinder saying, we need to protect Judaism from this terrible ethno-state. So I'm interested in what you think about that. There's
probably too much to say for just this podcast about that. I think Professor Ferziger is right about that analysis, and it's something that I've heard other people say. Maybe the boring sociological answer for it is that it used to be the case that issues of religion divided American Jews because the disparate strands of American Judaism understood each other as part of the same broader collective. For example, there was an attempt, I believe it was in the 80s, to come up with a Beit Din, a religious court that would be multi-dimensional to deal with conversions, because there was a fear that what did it mean that there were Jews who were recognized as Jews by some branches of Judaism and others by not, and others were not recognized as such. That effort failed. It didn't last very long. But it grew out of this feeling that there was something wrong with a situation in which, let's say, a Jew by patrilineal descent raised in the Reform community was not recognized as Jewish by their Orthodox peers. We're in a very different moment, and I don't think that anyone cares about that issue anymore. I don't think that the patrilineal Jew raised in the Reform movement cares that his Orthodox counterparts don't consider him Jewish according to halakha, and I also don't think that much of the Orthodox world really spends that much time worrying about the halachic status of a patrilineal Jew raised in the Reform movement. There's been a really big divergence between what I think you could call liberal Judaism or non-Orthodox Judaism and the Orthodox world. And so one reason why religious issues, I think, don't generate the kind of controversy that they do is that these are just two separate worlds in a sense, and they don't really engage very much with one another. I happen to have one foot in both, and so I see these different things. And it's striking to me the extent to which, for instance, liberal non-Orthodox Jews are totally ignorant of what's happening in the Orthodox world. And people in the Orthodox world only really get a very superficial look at what's happening in the liberal non-Orthodox streams of
But what
Judaism.
about the invoking of religion among these young Jews who are upset about Israel, who are detaching themselves to Israel? You know, the protests on campus that had the Passover Seders and did religious Jewish rituals to demonstrate that they are still Jewish, even though they are out there protesting against Israel, their quote unquote return to religion.
I mean, this is a subject that I take up in my book Tablet Shattered, which came out basically a year ago, and something I have a lot of thoughts about, and it's a phenomenon that I would say I've witnessed firsthand, and even in some ways been a participant observer in. I think that the discourse of young American Jews critical with Israel falls back onto religion, in part because that's really the primary alternative framework for Jewish identity that exists in the United States.
That you chronicle was replaced by Zionism.
Right. And so in some sense, if in the middle of the 20th century, American Jews basically said, okay, instead of having to deal with these really complicated questions about what does it mean to be a Jew in the modern world, how do we adapt traditional Jewish practice to suburban America, they said, let's just put these questions on hold for the most part. And our Judaism will be defined by support for Israel. The great literary critic Irving Howe has this amazing line, which I'm going to paraphrase, where he says that Israel and Zionism enabled American Jews to postpone the reconsideration of their Jewishness that the American condition required. And I think that's completely true. And what my book basically chronicles is what happens when Israel can't serve that purpose anymore. And so you have people wanting to explore religion as a way of decoupling, or at least as they describe it, as a way of decoupling from the kind of Zionist mid-century consensus. Now, I think there are a lot of contradictions, let's say, that remain to be worked out in that turn to religion. For instance, on the one hand, these are people who are saying, we want a Judaism that's decoupled from Israel. On the other hand, it's a kind of ritual revival that is almost entirely centered around Israel, but in the negative. So these are anti-Zionist minyanim that instead of having a prayer for, let's say, the state of Israel, now have a kind of ritual about tshuva for Jews committing the Nakba. That doesn't strike me as a decoupling. It's kind of a form of liberal religious anti-Zionism, which maybe doesn't have so much of a historical precedent. Maybe radical reform in some sense got close when in the late 19th century, the radical end of the reform movement said Jews are not a nation. We are an ethical tradition of universal values. And so we're going to reject the national components of the Jewish tradition. But it's a little bit incoherent in terms of what's the basic logic behind this new kind of religious practice? Why do you do what you do? One of the things that was, I would say, disconcerting was that I went into the book wanting to write, if not a defense defense of this return to religion among Jews critical of Israel than in some sense a kind of favorable analysis. And the more I dug into, well, what's behind this? What's the organizing logic behind this? It felt like there was a real lack of properly thought out ideas.
Josh, I wish we had a lot more time to talk, but I'm going to ask my final question, which is going to be a good question for you to be able to dig into because we all like to talk about ourselves. But I'm interested in how October 7th and the past 2 years have changed you, have affected your life, and not to be too navel-gazy, self-involved about it, but what it's going to be like for you in your role as a columnist for Haaretz from Israel, writing to an audience of diaspora Jews.
Well, I'll start from the end because I think that's the easier question to answer. My first real journalistic job out of college was as an editor and reporter at 972 magazine. And that was an incredible experience because they basically said, hey, kid, why don't you go out to the West Bank, report on what's happening there? And I really learned how to be a journalist through that sort of trial by fire experience, maybe. But it also imbued me with a very deep gratitude and relationship to the Israeli progressive world. And I've always seen my role wherever I was writing as doing, in part, translation work, translating the perspective of Israeli progressives fighting for a just Israel to an American audience. I did that when I was living in America, and I hope to be able to continue to do that now, and I'm super grateful to be able to do it at Haaretz. My life has changed very dramatically in the last 2 years since October 7th. I think that I realized that people who I thought were political allies were not political allies, that what I was fighting for was not the same as some of the people that I had made common cause with on parts of the radical left. But in some ways, the experience of waking up after October 7th and seeing people who I knew celebrate or justify the atrocities, one, it's an experience I'm never going to forget. But it also, I think, emboldened me to not accept certain things that I found immoral, but that maybe I was willing to overlook because, you don't want to harm the cause. You don't want to give more ammunition to the right. Now I think I never thought that argument was true when pro-Israel people made it. Oh, don't put out our dirty laundry. Don't criticize us. We're so besieged. And I don't think that argument is right when it's being made by progressives or people on the left. Oh, don't put out this criticism because we're so under siege. And I think it's dishonest. And so I'd say that the utterly jarring and horrific experience on that day was a catalyst for me to do a little bit of a cheshbon nefesh, a kind of self-check-in, and reorient my work in a direction that I hope has more integrity. It's more intellectually honest. Obviously, there are some personal things too that changed.
You came to Israel as a result, or you would have come to Israel anyway?
No, so my wife and I met years before October 7th in Jerusalem, and we were both part of, I would say, the activist community in some sense in Jerusalem. And we had been planning on coming back to Israel before October 7th. I was finishing up my coursework in my graduate degree. For personal reasons, that got delayed. And
As graduate work does.
And it took me a little bit longer to finish my coursework to be freed to leave campus. And so we ended up only moving after October 7th. But it also is the case that October 7th and what I saw in the place where I was at the time provided some important push factors and made that move feel more right and more necessary. I mean, a lot of people ask me, how could you move to Israel in the middle of its destruction of Gaza and the atrocious war that it's carrying out? And I don't see that as so much of a contradiction in the sense that if you want to change the place, I think you have to be there. So much of what I was preoccupied with before moving here appears to me now as a kind of meta discourse. Who's a Zionist? Are Zionists allowed to be progressive? No one here cares about that conversation. That conversation is for the consumption and preoccupation of people who are not here. And I didn't want to only be stuck intervening in the meta discourse. I wanted to try to intervene, if possible, in the reality.
Well, whatever brought you here, we are very happy to take you out of the meta discourse and into the mud on the ground here in the Middle East, in Israel. I'm really happy to have your voice in Haaretz, not to age myself, but I think it's really important to have somebody of your generation writing for us. So thanks for joining Haaretz, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thanks to my guest, Joshua Leifer, and to producer and editor, Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to our podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.